Good morning again. So I am going to begin James Joyce's novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. As you know that this is a modern novel. It's a thin novel of 5 chapters. Modern novels are usually thin as opposed to the Victorian novels which were pejoratively called as thick baggy monsters by Henry James. Novels by Dickens, Thackeray, even earlier Fielding, Richardson, they all wrote very thick novels. On the contrary, modern novels are thin and they are, we may say, a little more complex. And why we will understand that if we look at the intellectual history or the development of the intellectual history in Europe and America. So you know that novel mainly rose in the 18th century, and we also know that the 18th century is an age of rationalist philosophy, rationalistic ideas. To some extent, we often equate the 18th century with Enlightenment ideas, La Lumière in France, and we all associate the 18th century with empiricism, rationalism, and so on. So before we come to the modern times and a modernist novel like Joyce's novel, Portrait, which is also an autobiographical novel. We would like to look at this development of the ideas in the intellectual history. And as you know, that the 18th century was followed by the Romantic period, or the Age of Reason was followed by the Romantic period, and modernist novels, they came later, even after the Romantic period. So the Romantic ideas were born out of certain philosophical challenges to the ideas of the Enlightenment. So how these Romantic ideas gradually developed, it is important to see because A Portrait of the Artist is about the intellectual development of a young man and how religion, politics, literature influence the young man. That is important in this novel. So we will see that from the 18th century onwards, like in the early 18th century, Vico was a philosopher in Italy. I am writing his name in the chat box. Vico, who had written about mythology, and he thought that mythology was the new science. So from Vico onwards, mythology began to attract the notions of philosophers and thinkers. And later we know in the 19th century, mythology was very important. And even in this novel, A Portrait, we see use of myth. The Daedalus myth, for example, is one of the abiding myths in this novel. So, how was myth recognized, or how myth came to be recognized by thinkers? In the 18th century again, the German thinker Hamann, he glorified mythological stories I am writing the name Haman, and I will also have to mention Harder and Winkelmann, two other German philosophers. Winkelmann's writings on art were very important, and one may say that Harder and Winkelmann, they rediscovered ancient art. By ancient art, of course, one refers to classical art. And they found Greek mythology as highly creative and inclusive, whereas science appeared to them as fragmented. So these thinkers, they belong to the 18th century itself. It is the age of enlightenment. And yet they glorify art over science. So a critic named Isaiah Berlin has named these authors belonging to the counter-enlightenment. Isaiah Berlin talks about counter-enlightenment. So the whole idea of individualism was a post-romantic idea, because in the classical idea or in the mythological scenario, there was no reference to individual as genius. So that is a post-romantic idea. We see in the 18th century Dr. Johnson means judgment to be simply reason. So judgment is a very important word in the critical vocabulary in the 18th century. And Dr. Samuel Johnson identifies judgment with reason. The most important philosopher after the 18th century is Kant, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. He died in 1804, so born in 1724. So his dates more or less belong to the 18th century. He died at the very beginning of the 19th. So Kant, in his critique of judgment, referred to two kinds of judgment or two types of judgment. He called them reflective and teleological. So reflective or non-rational, and teleological or rational. In this Kant clearly puts a lot of emphasis on non-rational judgment over rational judgment, and that is a departure from the 18th century Enlightenment ideas where rationality was of supreme importance. So The non-rational gets a boost from Kant's philosophy, and gradually we see the non-rational was accepted and even emphasized by later philosophers. For example, Schopenhauer, Arthur Schopenhauer, more or less a 19th century philosopher, he divides the conceptual imaginary into two, will and idea. So his books are on the world as will and the world as idea. So by will he meant spontaneous imaginative responses. Will, imaginative. And idea, according to him, was rational response. Similarly, we find that Nietzsche died in 1900, that is just at the beginning of the 20th. So Nietzsche also talks about Dionysian and Apollonian approaches to art. Dionysian is irrational. And Apollonian stands for rational. If you read his book, The Birth of Tragedy, you will find an elaboration of these ideas. So Nietzsche emphasized the Dionysian or the irrational as much as the Apollonian or the rational. With the rise of modernism or modernistic novel, beginning from Henry James and the modernist poet T.S. Eliot, we see that they were concerned with the uniqueness of the self, like the romantics. But before we come to the modernists, we have to look at one major 19th century philosopher after Kant, Hegel. As you all know, that Hegel was an immense influence on the 19th century. Hegel emphasized on three phases of the mind. They are faith, imagination and reason. So the spirit wants to realize itself through mind, and the mind undergoes three phases of development in which there are faith, imagination and reason. So Hegel talks about spirit in the most abstract way. As a philosopher, he cannot talk about God, but he talks about the world spirit. So as the individual spirit undertakes an evolution through the phases of faith, imagination and reason, similarly Hegel conceptualized that the world spirit also wants to develop itself and finds development through these different ages where faith, imagination and reason play consequent roles. So the age of faith fostered religion, the age of imagination fostered art, and the age of reason fostered philosophy, according to Hegel. Civilization is rise and fall, realizing any phase of the mind. The only civilization in which the spirit manifested itself properly is the Greek civilization. So Hegel also glorified the Greek civilization by talking about it as the perfect manifestation of the spirit. So why the Greek civilization was the only perfect manifestation of the spirit? Why not the 18th century or the 19th century? Obviously, the balance that is required among these three aspects of the mind, faith, imagination and reason, Hegel thought that this balance was lost in these later periods when one particular aspect was emphasized. So probably he thought that in his time reason was more emphasized and therefore philosophy developed, and imagination wanted to express itself in the 19th century through the development of art. Faith or religion was gradually yielding place to these aspects, imagination and reason. So these will all be significant for our understanding of this particular novel. So now if we look at a chart where we chronologically look at the manifestation of particular aspects of the mind. So if we begin from medieval Christianity, we see that there is a hierarchy among spirit, reason and passion. So in the medieval age, in medieval Christianity, spirit was the most important. Below that was reason, and passion was considered to be the most unruly and should always be held in check by reason. So passion was looked down upon. In the Enlightened period, we see that hierarchy is there between reason and sensation. We know that Locke, the English philosopher, he also theorized about sensation. The empiricists, they theorized that we perceive the world through our senses. But what we perceive through the senses must be processed by reason so that we can make any meaning of them. So reason is superior to sensation. Then we come to Kant, and we see that Kant talks about teleological judgment and reflective judgment. We remember that teleological judgment is rational and reflecting judgment is non-rational, and both are attached importance in Kant's philosophy. And when we come to Freud, then we see that Freud talks about hierarchy in the mind. Before Freud, philosophers spoke about hierarchy in the different aspects of mind, but Freud analyzes the constituent parts of the mind inside the mind. So for him, the conscious self is the uppermost, but it is much smaller. The conscious part of the mind is much smaller compared to the unconscious, which is much larger. So if we think of the image of an iceberg, the tip of the iceberg will be the conscious self, and below that the huge portion that is underwater cannot be seen, that may be like the unconscious. And the conscious self itself is divided into superego and ego. So superego is constituted of the social, moral, restraints or demands made by culture. That is superego. And the ego is the conscious part of our mind which tells us that we must assert ourselves, that we must assert to ourselves to fulfill our desires. That is the ego. Then the non-conscious self is divided into Freud gives it another Latin name, id. So as ego is a Latin word which means I, id is also a Latin word which means it. So it refers to the unconscious, and Freud divides the non-conscious part, the id, into two, the pre-conscious and the unconscious. So the pre-conscious is in touch with the conscious. So it is like dreams, which is an interim between the conscious and the unconscious. And below the pre-conscious is the unconscious itself. So what is the purpose of tracing this intellectual history? To understand that intellectuals and thinkers over the periods, over the ages, they came to theorize about the unconscious, which made a great contribution to the development of Romanticism. They came to theorize about the ego. We find in the Romantic period the assertion of the ego, and the way spirit or faith lost its importance. We have to remember that spirit or faith ruled over us for many centuries. Religion ruled over us for many centuries, until beginning from the Enlightenment, it began to lose its importance. A great influence on Joyce and his character Stephen in this novel is that of St. Thomas Aquinas. Now you know that St. Thomas Aquinas was a medieval priest, medieval monk, and he was a theologian. St. Thomas Aquinas speaks of the differentia of man. Differentia is a Latin word. How man is different from other beings, from other creatures. According to Aquinas, it is his reason which is his differentia. In the spiritual hierarchy, man is at the bottom of rational beings. According to medieval Christianity, who are the other rational beings above man? God is at the top. Then the angels, they are also rational beings, and man is the lowest form of rational being according to this theology. In man, there is a hierarchy of reason and hierarchy of spirituality, reason and passion. So if you remember the Platonic theory of the great chain of being, that God is at the top, then there are the angels, then man, then animals, then vegetables, then material objects. So, Pico della Mirandola, the famous Florentine philosopher of the Renaissance, had argued that man's place is not fixed in this chain of being, but he can either go up or down the ladder. If he goes up and becomes more spiritual, then he can unite with God. If he goes down, then he can be like an animal, full of lust and other passions. If he further goes down and becomes very idle, then he has sloth like plants. He is like vegetables who do not move from place to place. And then man therefore can either become a god or become an animal or like inert objects. So man can go up or down. So Foucault said that was man's freedom. He was free to choose whether he will go up or he will go down. The Reformation did not make any change in this theological dogma. Dr. Faustus' parable of the transition, when judgment is exalted and its consequences feared. So the Renaissance is a transition period, and the assertion of human enterprise, the assertion of individuality, the desire of man, the ambition of man to fulfill all his desires, we find it represented in Dr. Faustus. Marlowe's play. Dr. Faustus wants unlimited power through unlimited knowledge. And why? What will he do with this power? He will fulfill his desire. For example, like having Helen of Troy, Helen of myth as his company, or dining with the Pope. So he has his strange desires which he wants to fulfill with the knowledge of magic, illicit knowledge. So this is a parable, we may say, where spirituality was neglected at the cost of man's desire to fulfill his ambition. In the Renaissance, spirit and reason are in a tussle. In the 17th century and onwards, spirit or faith becomes a matter of election. It is whether you will have faith or not, that becomes individual choice. In rationalist philosophy, God is the second proposition. So God is not the topmost idea anymore. In the 18th century rationalist philosophy, he is called as the second proposition. Rationalism and empiricism both believe in the supremacy of reason in the mode of cognition. So, according to rationalists and empiricists, what we come to know, cognition, in that the reason is the supreme, then memory, and then judgment, and rational hypothesis. To this, empiricism adds sensory perception. Like Descartes and Spinoza, they add this sensation and perception. Rationalists are still close to medieval Christianity in their desire to discover the truths of the cosmic universe. The theistic cosmic design which tries to cancel out diversities. In the 18th century empiricism, that is Hobbes and Locke, they do not believe in any such design, that the whole cosmos is a design. That theistic belief of the rationalists was not there anymore with Locke and Hobbes. They dissociated senses from passions. This is a prelude to the 19th century scientific revolution. So you see that Enlightenment, empiricism, rationalism, they all led to the scientific revolution in the 19th century. And when sensation and passion are distinguished, then sensation becomes the scientific term, passion falls in the realm of morality. In the modern world, we have a theme of finding of oneself. St. Thomas Aquinas had proposed that the church should supplement faith with reason. So this rationalist trend developed, and up to Newton, we may say that this trend could be seen developing the philosophical idea. And then in the 18th century we have the encyclopedists like Diderot, Penello and Holbach. They also thought that all knowledge can be gathered and can be classified. We find the importance of utilitarianism in the 18th century, which has been satirized by Dickens in his novel. So, 20th century, the modern period, is a period of crisis of faith. And how did writers and poets cope with that? Some of them went back to a belief in faith and religion once again, like T.S. Eliot, and others completely rejected faith. But again, there are some like James Joyce who portrays this conflict in the mind of the modern man. The German philosopher Jung has a book, Modern Man in Search of a Soul. So the notion that the modern man is in crisis and has lost his soul and therefore is out to find his soul back. So in this novel of portrait, Joyce presents this conflict in the character Stephen in his mind, where imagination, reason and passion, they all hold sway on him and are in competition. So we may say that the modern period is a period of fragmentation, where our psyches are fragmented, fractured. Now I will make a few comments on the question of point of view in the novel. Now, as you know that for novels, point of view is very important. That is the narrative strategy of a novel. This novel, we may say, is an experimental novel, because here Joyce experiments with the narrative strategy and point of view. He uses a style which is very close to the stream of consciousness style, about which we will speak later in greater detail. But he also uses the realistic style, of which he is a master. So you may say that in this alternation of two styles, you may see an attempt to balance the life of the mind and the life of the object, of the life of the world. But Joyce reaches this technique or this point of view after a lot of developments in the history of the novel. So, through the point of view, an author determines the reader's attitude to the character. So, what will be the central point of view of a novel? Sometimes it is the first person narrative. That is the very simple way of telling a story in the first person. We find this in Daniel Defoe. Then there is the epistolary novel, that is novel written in the form of letters. A number of characters write letters. And in the letters, the characters speak in the first person. So if 5 characters write letters, then we have first person narrative of 5 different persons in the same novel. Therefore, the epistolary novel is a little more complex, and it includes a number of points of view, and it is not possible to follow this in a small novel. It will be necessarily a thick novel or a big novel like Richardson. In Faulkner, The Sound and the Fury, or Virginia Woolf, The Waves, also we find this kind of point of view. In Fielding, you all know Tom Jones. I do not know whether you have read it. Fielding loved to call Tom Jones a comic epic in prose, which means that he wanted his novel to have an epic scope. So it is expansive and written in the third person narrative, third person point of view. So it has a panoramic view, but one character is predominant. So we have a centralized point of view. And Thackeray solves this problem. That is, if you make one central character the protagonist or hero or heroine of your novel, then you cannot give any other point of view. Thackeray solved this problem by making his heroine in Vanity Fair moving vertically from one class to another. The heroine from a pauper becomes rich, so moves across classes, and thus the character is one, but the point of view of different classes can be, offered through this strategy. James Joyce actually follows the technique of Flaubert. The French novelist Gustave Flaubert, his famous novel is Madame Bovary. What is the speciality of that novel? The narration is in the third person, but it gives the impression of the first person. You get the impression that Madame Bovary, that we are getting Madame Bovary's point of view, even though the narration is in the third person, not in the first person. So Joyce imitates Flaubert, and in a portrait also he gives a third person narrative throughout the novel, but creates an impression of the first person, as if we are looking at Stephen's point of view. Now there is another novelty here in this novel, that we get Stephen's point of view in the first person at the end of the novel, when he jots down in his diary from day to day at the end of his novel. And then he writes in the first person. So why does Joyce do this? Why doesn't he allow Stephen to speak in the first person throughout the novel? Because the novel is centered upon one character, Stephen. And we are going to see how his mind develops, evolves. So if Stephen spoke in the first person, it would have been much easier. So why doesn't Joyce do that? Joyce does not allow Stephen to speak in the first person because he represents Stephen from the age of a baby. At the beginning of the novel, Stephen is a baby. Then he becomes a little boy. Then he grows and becomes a little older, and then he becomes an adolescent. So different stages in the development of a child, and a child cannot have a mature point of view. So only when at the end of the novel, Stephen becomes a mature person, a young adult, then Joyce allows him first person point of view. So the issue here is representing the life of the mind. So this novel is complex in that sense, that it does not give us only a narration of events. Much more than the events, it is the mind of the protagonist that he wants to represent. And he wants his readers to get an idea about how this mind is evolving. So he wants to take us to the psychological depth of the mind of his hero. And therefore, the narration here cannot only be a linear narration, a horizontal movement of actions. On the contrary, it must also be vertical, that is where you probe deeper into the mind of the character. So that is one complexity of the novel. Secondly, how does one represent the parts of the mind which are in the unconscious? So that is not possible in the realistic manner. It is not possible to represent the unconscious or the subterranean desires of the character and so on. So Joyce takes the help of myth and symbolism. Myth takes us to the level of the unconscious. Jung had theorized that apart from individual unconscious, there is a collective unconscious of a people or a race. And this collective unconscious is represented through mythology, through myths of a race. And then symbols. Symbols can be interpreted in various ways, and therefore they are very helpful in describing the inner psyche, the movements of the unconscious. So you'll see how Joyce makes use of mythology, symbolism, and Jungian archetypes. Jung had theorized about archetypes, certain permanent aspects in the collective unconscious. So we'll look at all that. Now, this novel was written over a very long period, almost 14 years. The first draft of this novel, with the title The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, a portrait of the artist as a young man, not as a young man, a portrait of the artist. This was an essay that Joyce wrote in 1904. So you will find the textual history very well in this edition, the Norton edition of A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Can you see it? Can you see it? I am holding the book.
Sir, don't your videos old?
Here. A Portrait of the Artist.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So in the Norton edition. So the first draft is an essay, A Portrait of an Artist, in 1904. Then, he made a draft of a novel named Stephen Hero, where he thought that there will be 63 chapters. So it was a project of a novel named Stephen Hero, 63 chapters. Project. Now this huge novel, it was not published in Joyce's lifetime, and Joyce drastically reduced the length of the novel and ultimately made it a novel in 5 chapters. So imagine the compression from 63 chapters to 5 chapters, which was published as A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man in 1918. The form in which we have the novel today. This was initially published as a serial in the journal Egoist. The Egoist, and then later the first part of the novel A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man was published in 1907, and as I told you that the novel in 5 chapters as we have it today was published in 1918. So it has a long publication history, and the efforts to write this novel began from 1904 and it was finally published in 1918, which means that for 14 years Joyce worked on this novel. And that also indicates how Joyce attached a lot of importance to this novel. So after it became clear that the Stephen Hero project was not going to be successful, in 1905 he began to write the Dubliners. So even though he was writing other things, his project of writing this novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, was in hibernation or was temporarily suspended. He kept on working upon it. And we know that Joyce worked very laboriously. He took a lot of time to write. And there is a story that one day during a walk he met a friend, and his friend asked him, "So Joyce, how many words did you write today?" And James replied, "A great number." So he asked, "That's very good. So how many words did you write?" And he said, "I have already finalized 2 words that I am going to use." 2 words. So imagine, he finalized 2 words in a whole day. That means that he attached a lot of importance to the words that he was going to choose for writing his novel. And probably he was imitating the ideals of Flaubert in this also, because Flaubert, the French novelist, had theorized about the right word. The writer must choose the right word, and in French it is called le mot juste, the right word. So for choosing the right word, it may take a lot of time. Finally, Stephen Hero was published posthumously, and today you can read the Stephen Hero also if it is in the library, and you will see that some of the ideas are described in the Stephen Hero in a much more elaborate way, which are very cryptic in this novel because of its much shorter length. Stephen Hero is much lengthier. So we have, for example, the discussion and definition of epiphany, an idea which Joyce uses in this novel. It is defined and described in the Stephen Hero much better. In this novel, A Portrait, Joyce does not describe it at all, does not define it either, does not use the word also, but he makes use of epiphany nevertheless in this novel. So if we did not have Stephen Hero or earlier draft, then we would not have known that Joyce was using these ideas in a portrait. So A Portrait is a much more compact novel, and therefore being experimental in so many ways, giving the inner life of the hero, which you can realize that is a contribution to modernism by the development of psychoanalysis. Freud, Jung, and other leaders in psychoanalysis, they developed the theory, from which it became clear to writers and authors that one must look into the unconscious of the characters or the unconscious of the people. It is not sufficient to describe only what we perceive at the conscious level. Much of our mental life lies in the unconscious. So Joyce uses all these concepts in this novel. So I will stop here. If you have any questions, you can ask.